topic of my talk is AccessibleJS. And basically what we're going to be talking about is how to write JavaScript in an accessible manner. So I do have a lot of talks related to accessibility. I've done accessible CSS, accessible React. Accessible is a really hard word to say, so I'm just going to skip it. I've done React, CSS, HTML, all of it. And the main thing is that I've noticed is that when you're trying to write code in an accessible manner, it's a matter of deliberation and not so much like knowing it off head. Like, you can never really know everything there is to know about accessibility. You just have to be intentional about it, and your code will reflect that. So yeah, a little about me. My name is Jemima. I am a self-taught front-end developer and school-taught systems engineer, originally from Lagos, Nigeria, but I'm currently living in Lithuania, which is where I work. Also, you can find me online anywhere at Jemima. So that's Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever. Feel free to connect with me. I love like hearing from people all over the world, basically. So the first point of my talk is, what is accessibility? Okay, I didn't plan to take a poll, but like if you could click like the raise hand motion in the chat if you've heard of accessibility before or you've previously worked with accessibility, just so I kind of have like an idea of how many people know what accessibility is. All right, we have 3, 4. 4 is a good number. I mean, you can still raise your hand if you know what accessibility is, but 4 people, that's a nice number. So what is 5, great. What is accessibility? Simply put, accessibility is the practice of building products that everyone can use. So now whenever I say this, it always sounds like an oxymoron, you know, because like, why would you build a product that no one can use? For example, think about if you were an architect and you were designing a building, but then the building didn't have a door. People would be like, you're not very good at your job. Because that's not how you design buildings. You have to make things that people can use. If you design a building, you want people to be able to enter it. But then when we see buildings that don't have wheelchair ramps, for example, people using wheelchairs can't enter those buildings. So those are people that can't use your product. So now you're building that product and you're thinking it has a door, people can open the door, people can enter the door. But what's the path to that door? How are you creating a method that everyone can use that door? So all these things, keeping all these things in mind when you're building, that is what accessibility is. Accessibility is making sure that you build products that everyone can use. And when we say everyone, we don't just mean you. So yeah. And then when it comes to web accessibility, there's accessibility in the physical aspect, that is making sure that your things are like usable, like having braille signs or having disabled parking. And then there's web accessibility. Web accessibility is building websites that everyone can use, because the web is for everyone, so everyone should be able to use that. I think that was something Tim Berners-Lee said or something. So basically with web accessibility, there are like 5 main points to consider. We want to consider navigation, auditory, visual, sound, and motor capabilities. So navigation is things like, how do people interact with your site? How do people scroll through your site? Are people using keyboards? Are they using mice? It's mouses, yeah. Like if it's a computer mouse, you say mouses, not mice. It'd be really weird if we said mice. So yes, people using computer mouses. And then when it comes to auditory, like, do you have sound or notifications on your site that are purely dependent on people hearing them? Are you providing videos or media that require people to listen to them? And if you're providing those things, are you providing like ways for people who can't hear to listen to those things? Visual cues, like, do you have appropriate contrast between your text and your background? So accessibility is not just for people who have disabilities, it's also for like abled users. For example, if you're using your phone under like we can see someone here is under very bright sun. So if they were using their phone under directly bright sun, it'd be kind of hard to see like certain text. Like my phone does this thing where it like reduces its brightness automatically. But if I go out in the sun, I can't see. And then because I can't see, I can't turn the brightness back up. And it's literally the most frustrating thing for me, because I have to start looking for shade to turn up my brightness. So basically, if you're creating a website that's too light or too dark for people to see it in certain circumstances, that's not accessible. Same thing with hearing stuff. And then also cognitive accessibility. So cognitive accessibility is a bit more, it's very nuanced, because it's important to present information in a way that you're not overloading users. Some people get like sensory overload. Some people just have like attention deficit disorder. If you're providing too much content, or you're not providing content in a way that's easy for people to understand, then that's not really accessible. So these are all the like many methods of accessibility there are, and there are many ways of writing them and understanding them. But in this talk, we're going to be focusing on how to write JavaScript in an accessible way. Yeah. I forgot this part of the slide. Why is accessibility important? Accessibility is important because, you see, I knew I had this somewhere because when I said it earlier, I was like, didn't I have this quote in my slide? Yeah, that's what I said. The web is for everyone, so everyone should be able to use it, by Tim Berners-Lee. That is why accessibility is important. And also because it's a legal requirement. So in America, for example, in the US, I think it's under the ADA that there are like legal requirements for having accessibilities in your websites, and people who do not build accessible websites are liable to be sued. There have been a case, like a number of lawsuits for not having an accessible website. I think it was in 2018 that Beyonce's agency, like Parkwood Entertainment, it was sued because someone was trying to buy tickets on her site, like Beyonce.com, and they couldn't buy the tickets. So like they went to court and it was a whole thing. So like if Beyonce's agency can get sued, nobody is safe. So yeah, pretty much like the legal aspect. But then also I think it's very important, accessibility is important from like a human aspect. When I was in university, I stayed in this, they called it like special rooms. So I had two visually impaired roommates. So basically I would help them like do simple things on their phones, like scroll through Facebook or go to websites. And I don't know if you've ever used your phone on the accessibility mode. Like if you have a phone like good settings, you can turn on the accessibility mode, but it's much different to scrolling like with the hold on. My window was open and I could hear sounds from outside. It's much different to scrolling with like the native method. For example, if you're trying to scroll on your phone with accessibility mode, you have to use two fingers. If you're trying to click a button, you have to double tap. If you're trying to highlight text, it's a lot. So basically the point is that using your phone on accessibility mode, it's a different method than using it normally. So for me as an able user, for example, I just found it like tiresome, because for me, when I was trying to help them do something as simple as check their email or something, to me it seemed like it was just a very long process, but to them that's the only way they can use their phones. And then sometimes we would go on websites and then these websites would have like really tiny icons, and if you're trying to double tap something that's really tiny, it's like a game of luck at best, because you tap the first time and the second time you miss, so you have to start the process all over again. So things like this, things like experiencing it firsthand, it really lets you understand like you're not just building this thing for yourself or to check off a mark on your like performance scale. You're building it so that actual people, actual humans can use it. We've seen this a lot since the pandemic started. I almost called it the Panda Express, but it's a pandemic. Since it started and people have been having to stay at home, a lot of people are staying at home now, so they're relying on the internet more than usual. You need to order food, you need to buy clothes online, all these things. If your sites that are providing these services aren't accessible, you are preventing your users from being able to actually use your site. So, it's problematic for you as well. But then that's the whole spiel on accessibility and why it's important. And now we're just going to get to some code, which is fine. So accessibility and JavaScript. So when it comes to different languages, they all have different ways of aiding accessibility. You can use HTML for semantics. You can use CSS for presentation. When it comes to JavaScript, JavaScript is mostly used for interaction. So interaction is like how users navigate through your site. For example, when they're using their mouses or they're using their keyboards, and also how you present content. These days, a lot of sites are built with JavaScript, like React or Angular or Vue, and a lot of the content is provided conditionally. So if you're writing code and you're like, oh, okay, if this condition is true, then show this thing, but if it's false, then don't show this thing. How are you communicating to screen readers when that content has been updated? How are you letting people know that there's content here that will be updated if a certain action is carried out? All these things, the way users interact with your site, thinking about all these things is how accessibility works. So in this presentation, we're just going to be going through some use cases of like when JavaScript can be used to improve accessibility. So how do we write accessible JavaScript? The first thing, like we mentioned before, is content. So JavaScript is very commonly used for displaying content. So that's like when you have your toggle switches, which you're showing and you're hiding content, or you're displaying content after a certain time. So here we just have like a simple button that shows and hides content. Now, if you're writing JavaScript for the code for this, it'd just be a matter of like, you could change the class name, or you could let the content be shown because you have a state property is active, or there are many ways of doing this. But then how do your users actually know? For example, someone that's using a screen reader, if I click this button, how are you communicating to me that new content has been introduced on this page? One way to do that is to toggle the ARIA hidden property. So now ARIA hidden property is a property that communicates to screen readers when content is visible or not visible on the page. It's something that we use to hide content from screen readers, because sometimes if you're just hiding your content with CSS, like you just say display none, no, display none is hidden from screen readers. But let's say you do like visibility hidden, for example, that doesn't necessarily hide it from screen readers. So if you don't want screen readers to be able to access that content in that time, the best bet is to set an ARIA hidden property. So if you're writing this in React, for example, you could easily just target the, do I have a pointer here? I do. If you're writing this in React, you could easily just target, I love this pointer. You could easily just target the attributes. If you're writing it in vanilla JavaScript, you can just set your attributes ARIA hidden to false. So basically what this means is if I have set my content to be visible, then it should no longer be hidden. So ARIA hidden is false. But if the content is not visible, then set ARIA hidden to true. This is one way of communicating to screen readers that, okay, update this property is visible now, so read it out, or this property is not visible, so don't read it out. So that's one method. Another method we have is timed content. It's not necessarily timed content, it's just something that, let's say it updates over a certain interval of time. If I'm using a screen reader, how do you communicate that this text here is changing itself? Like how do you communicate that it's going from 5 to 4 to 3 to 1? Because if a screen reader reads through this thing, they probably just go, this content will disappear in 3 seconds and that's all. So a method of doing that is the ARIA live property. Now, ARIA live property is an attribute that lets screen readers know when content will be updated. So you can have ARIA live polite, and I think ARIA live, I think forceful. I cannot remember the other one. But basically, there's one for saying, read this. So if you set it to forceful, I cannot remember the name is forceful right now. But if you set it to that one, then it just interrupts the screen reader from whatever is on the screen, and then it reads out that content itself. But if it's set to polite, basically what it will do is that it's going to read out this content will disappear in, and then it will update all the content. It will read out the updates in this place first, and then once it's done with that, it moves on to the next part. So how do we handle this in JavaScript? Basically, we are targeting our ARIA live property with our set attributes JavaScript code like we did before. So now you can see that here, we're setting ARIA hidden to true. So in this code here, basically, if the timer is done, I was really trying hard not to write code, but it was like hard to explain how the logic would work without the code. So I hope the code is like clear, because I wasn't sure if everyone wrote JavaScript or not. But basically, we're setting a countdown timer for 5 seconds on this content here. And once the timer gets to 5 seconds, to 0 seconds, because we're subtracting it, then we want to hide our content, and we also want to turn off the ARIA live property on the timer. Once we turn off the ARIA live property on the timer, the screen reader no longer gives it constant updates. Hope that makes sense. So yeah, that's just an example of how we can handle displaying content to screen readers or constantly showing updates for new content, basically. Also, if you all have any questions, please, once again, feel free to leave them in the chat, and I will get to them once the talk is over. And then the second part of accessibility with JavaScript is handling navigation. This is a very important part, I think, because a lot of times we end up, well, you'll see in the examples. So in this GIF, we can see like this is how users that are not using mouses, if I'm using a keyboard and I'm tabbing through a page, this is how it would look to me. I am just jumping from one focusable element to the next. So I go from the logo to the links to these buttons down here to all the buttons or whatever part of the page has focus. So this is how users tab through a page. So it doesn't just look like scrolling. So one thing that we have in JavaScript, one thing that we do a lot, especially in React, is that we create our own custom elements. For example, I think a dropdown is a very commonly custom element that's created, because just today I was working on this filter component and I used like the select tag, but then it turns out that in Windows, the thing just looks blank because the color I was using was white. So Windows select has like a white background, so it was just white text and white background. But on Mac, it looks fine because Mac uses like their own OS thing. So it was a whole thing, and that's create a custom element. So basically, when you're creating custom elements, you also need to take in all the considerations that semantic elements have by default. So semantic elements are the HTML elements that were created to do these specific things. So select, for example, is a HTML semantic element. So if I'm creating my own custom element, I need to try to emulate the semantic element as closely as possible. So let's say I try to create a button first. So now this is a custom button that is a div, So what do I need to do to make sure it's clear that it's a button? First, you can assign a role button and also give it a tab index. Tab indexes are what makes things focusable. So back to this example here, the reason all these things are able to get focus on the screen is because they have a tab index. So divs by default do not have tab indexes and divs do not get focus. So if you're using a custom element that is a div, you need to give it its own tab index. And that key feature in accessibility is, one sec. Great. The skip to main content link. So skip to main content link is a link that is present on pages that usually have a lot of navigation that just allows you like skip all the links and kind of just go to the main content. So if you have a page that's like very link heavy at the top and a user that is tabbing would have to tab through all those links, it's really bad user experience. So having a skip to main content link is just something that allows them bypass all those links and goes directly to main content. And then here you can see that we gave it a tab index of 1. What this means is that it will get the first focus on the entire page. So tab indexes work in a I don't know why I tried to say that word. I can never pronounce it. That word that's like hierarchy, but then it has like AL at the end. So if I have all my elements usually have a tab index of 0. So if I give something a tab index of 1, that means it automatically has a higher tab index than everything else on the page. If I give it a tab index of 2, it has a higher tab index and so on and so forth. So for my skip to main content link, I want to make sure that it gets the first focus on the page regardless of any other things. So I just give it a tab index of 1. And then also we can use tab indexes to hide content to make sure that you don't get focus. This is something people forget to do a lot of times, especially when you do things like creating modals or putting sidebar components. So you think that just because you hid something with CSS, like just because you shifted it away from the screen, it means that your users can't interact with it. But no, if I am tabbing through a page, I can still access that your sidebar, or I can still access your modal if you are not preventing the users from being able to focus on that element. So one way of doing that is to make sure that you're setting your tab index to -1. So a tab index of -1 means that that element will never gain focus until you change the tab index back to 0. So yeah, that's that about that. So here, this is just like a little GIF of how the skip to main content link works. So you can just hide it with CSS, and basically once it gets focus, you just present it and it just allows users to skip to the main content. So yeah, that's pretty much it. We have your skip button and we have your main content button, and once skip button is clicked, just give main content focus. Another use case of using the focus key is if you want something on your page to gain focus automatically. I think on YouTube, for example, if you go to the YouTube page, the search bar automatically has focus, like once you load the page. So basically how you just do that is window unload search bar focus. This is another way you can bypass the whole tabbing through multiple links in the navigation thing. Yeah, and then also updating focus. This is what I was talking about with when you have like a modal on your screen, or when you have something on your screen that you're trying to hide or you're trying to give focus after a certain time. If you are going to display something on the screen that should get focus immediately, then you give that thing the focus immediately. So sometimes when people create modals, if I tap through the thing and I press enter and the modal displays, I have to tap through the rest of the page before I can get focus back on that modal. And the reason for that is because they did not update focus to actually target that modal once it had been opened. So that's just an example of how you can make sure to do that. And then we have interaction. So interaction, this is basically just how like people interact with your site. Yeah, this is a cat GIF. I call this my rest stop because at this point in the program, I just want to make sure like everyone is following and everything. Also, if you have any questions, like if it's any pressing questions regarding anything I've talked about previously, we could just take it now. If not, you can just take a breather, have a glass of water, enjoy the cat typing. Great, I will get on with it. So how do we handle our handler events in JavaScript? So there's this thing I like to say, it's like for every, wow, my mind completely blanked. It's like that thing that's like for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Yeah, for every mouse event, there should be an equal and just equal keyboard event. So what that means is if I'm creating a custom element that can be clicked, you want to also make sure that thing can be clicked with the keyboard, not just the mouse. So here I am setting my onClick property, but I also want to make sure to have an onKeyPress property because not everyone is navigating through your site using a mouse. Some people use keyboard, some people use like those scrolly pad things that I never know what they are. So yeah, handler events, very important. Okay, I guess that was all I had on that section. That took me aback. And then we have the testing for accessibility sessions. So like a lot of times when you write your code or when you've built your web page and everything, how do you know that what you've written is accessible? What's like an easy way of testing that? So there are a couple of methods that I like to use personally when I'm building web pages, depending on if it's like a business case or if it's like for my personal website. So I think for personal websites, I do have a bit more leeway. I can spend a lot more time on accessibility, but for business cases, I'm trying to meet deadlines and everything. So with those ones, I really focus more on the code aspect and less on the testing aspect, which is not great, but sometimes you have to balance things. So there are manual tests that we can do. So you can just go on your own page and make sure that everything works how you expect it to work. Navigate through your page completely using a keyboard. Is there any hidden content that's getting focused? Is your focus element getting lost in the sidebar because you forgot to update that? Is there anything which is mouse operable that does not get keyboard focus? Because sometimes you have buttons that you can click, but users can't tab through them. That's not good. Are there any custom controls or widgets that cannot be controlled by keyboard only use? Just all these things. You want to make sure that you're meeting all these requirements. I think personally, I also end up having an accessibility checklist that really helps me when I'm writing code. I also use the accessibility tool. It's a VS Code extension. So that also helps me when I'm writing the code to make sure that my code is semantic at least, and that I'm not missing out on things. Oh, I didn't include it here. I can't remember the name right now. I'll check one of my other slides. But yeah, these are also some tools that I use for testing accessibility. There's the Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation tool. It's a website, and you can just enter the URL of your website, and it lets you know all the things you're doing right or wrong. There's also Lighthouse. Lighthouse is a really cool tool on Chrome DevTools that provides you with like an audited report and just gives you some tips or some clues on how to update your thing. There's ChromeVox. ChromeVox is a screen reader that I use on Chrome, or if you use a Mac, you could also use the VoiceOver tool on Mac. It's just like you can navigate through your own page using the screen reader, and it kind of lets you know what you're doing. There's ally.js. This is just like a cool resource for writing accessible JavaScript, basically. And okay, we have the resources and we have the demo. So demo is just like all the code that I was showing before, like with the links and the focus and everything. So we can see them there. We have the source code, and we also have the link to these slides, which is on my website, jemima.com/talk/accessible-js. I'm trying to think if I can. Yeah, it's fine. We have time. I wanted to run through one of my other slides on accessibility testing. Was it this one? Yeah, it was this one. Great. So these are the tools I was talking about earlier. So we have the Lighthouse tool in Chrome DevTools that just allows you generate like audit reports based on your categories. And then this is what like the results would look like, and it kind of tell you what you did wrong or what you could fix and all of that. We have the web accessibility evaluation tool. You can just enter the URL of your site, and it gives you a summary of like things to fix or things that you should check on. And then this is the web accessibility VS Code extension that I was talking about. So in this one, it basically just like targets your semantic elements while you're typing and kind of lets you know what you can fix. Here we can see that it targets using semantic elements or setting rules. So instead of using divs as random containers, you want to like target them specifically. And yeah, the accessibility checklist. Yeah, so basically this is just like a list I use when I'm writing code. It's a really helpful way of like knowing. Basically, if you keep accessibility in mind when you're writing your code, it saves you more time than like writing everything and then testing and then going back to fix it. So yeah, this is just like an example of some things that I would use. So here we can see that it covers keyboard navigation, including the skip navigation button. Oh, sorry. Let me make sure I hope this is visible. So yeah, using links, skip navigation, keyboard navigation, zoomability, all these things that are basically just dynamic content. So it's just a really good way of like keeping in mind, because sometimes you may not remember everything accessibility related, but if you have a checklist, then you will know. So yeah, this is under my talk, Understanding Accessibility. So if you do want those links, you can just, same site, different URL. And yeah, I think that's all. Wait, no, I have to end the talk. My bad. Okay, so yeah, those are all the resources. And then if you do want to read up some more on accessibility with JavaScript, you can check out some of these articles. Really nice one. This one is by Manuel. It's an article. It's also a presentation that he did. So you can either watch the video or read the slides. Really great. Just a bunch of really nice links that I found useful and I think would kind of explain better the like, and then also this one, like this, I think this is like my most useful resource right now. It's the WAI ARIA authoring practices. So basically when you are creating a lot of custom elements, you may not know which ARIA roles to assign to them. Because like if you're creating a custom button, then you know that the role is button. What about when you're creating a custom tabbing element or a custom select dropdown? So this basically just lets you know which role to assign to which components, depending on what you're building. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you do have any questions, I will be taking them now, or if you want to connect with me after, you can send me a message on my website, jemimaabu.com, or on LinkedIn at Jemima Abu, or Twitter, and I'm done sharing. Yay.